Another Tuesday night, another empty lobby. I'd been working the evening shift at Whispering Pines for 6 months now, and the routine had become second nature. Check the registry, update the logbook, follow the 5 rules that kept the place running. Most importantly, follow the 5 rules that kept me breathing. Rule 1. Never ask guests their real names. Rule 2. If the lobby clock shows 3:33 on all positions, step outside for exactly 20 minutes. Rule 3. Room 3 stays vacant between sunset and sunrise. Rule 4. Any woman in a red dress gets refused service immediately. Rule 5. If you hear movement in the tunnels during non-emergency hours, ignore it completely. Simple enough. I'd memorized them my first week, written them on index cards I kept in my shirt pocket, and never questioned why a roadside motel in northern Ontario needed supernatural protocols. The pay was decent, the isolation suited me fine, and my predecessor Dale Bean had left behind a stack of incident reports that made it clear: follow the rules or disappear. Speaking of disappearing, Dale had managed exactly that 3 months ago. One night he was here. Next morning he wasn't. His car remained in the employee lot for 2 weeks before Thomas Vargas, the owner I'd never actually met, had it towed. The official story was that Dale had quit without notice, but I'd found his coffee mug still warm in the break room that morning, his jacket hanging on the back of his chair. The brown-cloaked figure appeared at my desk without a sound. I looked up from my crossword puzzle to find him standing there, massive and still, his face hidden in shadow beneath his hood. Room 3's occupant. He never spoke, never removed the cloak, never stayed past checkout time. But 3 nights a week, he materialized at my counter and placed his key on the worn wood surface. Tonight was no different. The key, old brass, with a faded plastic tag reading 3, clicked against the desk. I palmed it without making eye contact, another rule I'd created for myself based on Dale's notes. "I'll have it ready in 20 minutes, I said to his chest, which was about as high as I was willing to look. The figure nodded once and dissolved back into the shadows near the stairwell. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and headed upstairs. Room 3 felt like stepping into a meat freezer. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite the October weather being fairly mild, and the smell hit me immediately. Wet earth, decomposing leaves, something organic and old. The bed hadn't been slept in, which was standard. The bathroom showed no signs of use, but the carpet around the window held muddy footprints that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, and the air conditioner was running full blast despite being set to heat. I worked quickly, changing the sheets that didn't need changing, wiping down surfaces that weren't dirty, and trying not to think about what kind of guest left mud prints but never used the bed. 15 minutes later, I was back downstairs, placing the key in its designated spot behind the counter. The brown-cloaked figure had vanished, which meant he was either back in his room or had left the building entirely. Both possibilities seemed equally likely and equally impossible. I was updating the room status in my logbook when headlights swept across the lobby windows. A battered silver Honda Civic pulled into the parking lot, engine coughing like it had been pushed too hard for too long. The driver sat for a moment, silhouetted against the dashboard glow before killing the engine and stepping out. She was maybe mid-30s, average height, with copper-red hair that caught the parking lot lights. She moved with purpose but also exhaustion, like someone who'd been driving for hours and wasn't quite ready to stop. When she pushed through the front door, I got a better look. Green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, determined jawline, and the kind of focused intensity that meant she wanted something specific. "I have a reservation," she said, approaching the counter. "Kennedy, Angela Kennedy." I checked the computer screen, then the paper backup log, then the computer again. "I'm not showing anything under Kennedy for tonight." "Check tomorrow, or yesterday. Your system might be off." She leaned forward slightly, and I caught a whiff of coffee and stress sweat. "I called 3 days ago, spoke to someone about a room for tonight through the weekend. The thing was, I hadn't taken any calls for reservations in the past week. Thomas handled all bookings through some online system I didn't have access to, and walk-ins were rare enough that I remembered everyone. But Angela Kennedy seemed less frustrated than desperate, and something about the way she kept glancing toward the tunnel entrance near the front desk set off my internal warning system. "Let me check the backup files," I said, buying time while I tried to figure out what her angle was. The tunnel entrance was just an old door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," probably led to storage or mechanical rooms. Most guests didn't even notice it, but Angela's eyes had been drawn to it twice since she'd walked in. "Actually," she said while I pretended to search through non-existent backup files, "maybe you could help me with something else. I'm looking for information about one of your previous employees. Dale Bean? He would have worked the night shift here, probably until earlier this year." My hand stopped moving across the keyboard. Dale's name wasn't something I'd expected to hear from a random guest, especially not someone who claimed to have a reservation, but clearly didn't. The disappearance had been kept quiet. No police reports, no missing person investigation, no local news coverage. Just one day, Dale was here. The next, he wasn't. "I'm not supposed to discuss former employees," I said, which was both true and a convenient way to avoid questions I couldn't answer. "Right, of course. It's just that he's my..." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Look, I know this is irregular, but Dale is my brother. He stopped returning my calls 3 months ago, and his landlord said he abandoned his apartment. I've been trying to trace his last known whereabouts, and his credit card records show charges here right up until he disappeared. Brother." That explained the desperate edge to her voice, and also made this conversation significantly more complicated. If Angela Kennedy was telling the truth, she had every right to ask questions about Dale. If she wasn't, then her knowing his name and employment history suggested she was fishing for information about something else entirely. "I can give you room 7, I said, deflecting while I tried to process, "but I'll need a credit card and ID." She handed over both without hesitation, which was either a good sign or evidence that she was very good at whatever game she was playing. Angela Kennedy, address in Toronto, credit card that looked legitimate. I ran it through the system and watched her shoulders relax slightly when it went through. "Dale was a good worker," I said while printing her room key. "Quiet guy. Always followed procedures." "What kind of procedures?" The question came too quickly, too specifically. I handed over her key and receipt, keeping my expression neutral. "Standard stuff. Security checks, guest services, maintenance reports." Angela nodded, but I could tell she wanted to push for more details. Instead, she hefted her overnight bag and headed for the stairs. "Thank you. I'll probably be up late. I have some work to catch up on." "Hope that won't be a problem." "No problem at all." She paused at the foot of the stairs. Did Dale ever mention having any concerns about the job? Anything that might have made him want to leave suddenly? The honest answer was yes. Dale's incident reports had become increasingly erratic in the weeks before his disappearance, full of observations that didn't quite make sense, and references to guests who broke rules I was still learning existed. But admitting that would require explaining things I didn't understand myself. "He seemed happy here," I said instead. I was surprised when he left. Angela studied my face for a moment, clearly weighing whether to push further. Finally, she nodded and climbed the stairs to the second floor. I watched her go, noting the way she moved. Careful but not cautious, like someone who expected to find exactly what she was looking for. Room 7's door closed with a soft click, and I was alone in the lobby again. I tried to go back to my crossword puzzle, but Angela Kennedy's questions had stirred up thoughts I'd been avoiding for months. Dale's disappearance. The incident reports that made no sense. The rules that kept me safe from dangers I couldn't identify. An hour passed, then another. The lobby stayed empty except for the usual creaks and settling sounds that old buildings made at night. I did my routine security walk, checking locks, testing the emergency lighting, making sure the coffee pot was clean for the morning shift. Everything normal. Everything according to protocol. When I came back to the front desk, Angela Kennedy's room light was still on. I told myself it was none of my business. Guests could stay awake as late as they wanted, work on whatever projects they brought with them, stare out their windows if that's what helped them sleep. But something about the quality of the light bothered me. Too steady, too focused. Not the warm glow of someone winding down for the night, but the harsh brightness of someone deep in concentration. I checked the time. 12:47 a.m. Rule 3 was in effect, which meant room 3 should be empty, but I'd learned not to make assumptions about what should and shouldn't be happening at Whispering Pines. Instead, I grabbed a cup of coffee and settled in for the long stretch until morning. From my position behind the counter, I had a clear view of the parking lot and partial sight lines to the second-floor windows. Angela's Honda sat alone under the security lights, and room 7's window glowed like a beacon against the dark building. Through the glass, I could make out her silhouette, sitting at what looked like a laptop, typing with the kind of rapid-fire intensity that suggested serious work. But what made me uncomfortable wasn't her late-night productivity. It was the way she kept stopping to stare directly at room 3, the room that was supposed to be vacant. The room where impossible things happened just often enough to keep me following rules I didn't understand. The room where a brown-cloaked figure materialized 3 nights a week and left behind mud prints that shouldn't exist. Angela Kennedy knew something about Dale Bean that she wasn't sharing, and now she was watching room 3 like she expected something to happen. I checked the lobby clock. 1:15 a.m. Still hours until sunrise. Still deep in the territory where Whispering Pines showed its true nature. I settled back in my chair and kept watch, wondering if tonight would be the night I finally understood what had happened to Dale Bean, or if I'd end up disappearing myself. I was still nursing my 3rd cup of coffee when Angela Kennedy appeared in the lobby at exactly 7 a.m., looking like she hadn't slept at all. Her copper hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she'd traded yesterday's exhausted determination for something sharper and more focused. She walked straight to my desk without the usual guest pleasantries about checkout times or breakfast options. "We need to talk," she said, placing her phone on the counter between us. "About Dale Bean." I glanced toward the front door, expecting my replacement for the day shift to walk through any minute. Having this conversation in the open lobby felt like a bad idea, but Angela's expression made it clear she wasn't planning to wait for a more convenient time. "I told you last night. You told me he was a good worker who seemed happy here." She swiped her phone screen and turned it toward me. "This is the last text message my brother sent to anyone. 3 months ago, the night before he disappeared. The message was short. The rules aren't what we think. There's something else here." I stared at the screen longer than necessary, my mind racing through implications I didn't want to consider. Dale had sent that text at 11:47 p.m. according to the timestamp, which would have been during his shift. The night before, I'd found his coffee mug still warm in the break room. "He never mentioned having concerns about the job," I said, handing the phone back. "Right, because you weren't here yet." Angela's voice carried the particular edge that came from staying up all night connecting dots. "I've been digging through his credit card records, his phone logs, everything I could find. Dale worked here for 8 months. You've been here for 6. That means there were 2 months when something changed enough to make him question rules he'd apparently been following without problems." She was right, and we both knew it. I'd assumed Dale's incident reports were just the kind of weird observations anyone would make working nights at a place like Whispering Pines. But if he'd been fine for 6 months before things got strange, that suggested something had shifted in the motel's operations around the time he'd started documenting impossible guests and rule violations. "Maybe he was just burned out," I said. "Night shifts can mess with your head. Dale texted me every Sunday for 2 years. Every single Sunday, usually about whatever book he was reading or some new recipe he'd tried. Then nothing. No goodbye, no explanation, no contact with anyone who mattered to him. Angela leaned forward, and I caught that same scent of coffee and determination from last night. People don't just disappear unless something makes them disappear. Before I could respond, the front door chimed, and Thomas Vargas walked into the lobby. I'd been working at Whispering Pines for 6 months, and this was the first time I'd seen the owner in person. All our communication had been through written notes left in the office safe, schedule changes, supply requests, reminders about protocol compliance. I'd started to wonder if Thomas Vargas actually existed or if he was just a name on paperwork. But here he was, maybe 55, medium height with graying hair, and the kind of solid build that suggested he'd done physical work before owning a motel. He wore a burgundy cardigan over a white shirt, and his expression shifted from casual friendliness to visible discomfort the moment he saw Angela standing at my desk. "Zane, good morning," he said, extending a hand I shook automatically. "I was in the area and thought I'd check in, see how things are running." His smile was warm but forced, and his eyes kept darting between Angela and the phone still in her hand. Angela, for her part, was studying Thomas with the same intensity she'd used on Dale's text message. "This is Angela Kennedy," I said, because the silence was getting awkward. "She's in room 7. "Ms. Kennedy." Thomas nodded politely, but there was definitely tension in his voice. "I hope everything's been satisfactory." "Actually, I was just asking Zane about a former employee. Dale Bean? He was my brother." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something happened around his eyes, a tightening that suggested Angela's presence here wasn't as random as he'd hoped. "I'm sorry, I don't discuss personnel matters with guests." "Of course not." Angela pocketed her phone, but her gaze stayed locked on Thomas. "I just thought someone might remember him. He spoke so highly of this place. That was a lie, and we all knew it. Dale had disappeared without explanation, leaving behind only cryptic text messages and incident reports that read like fever dreams. But Angela delivered it with such casual confidence that Thomas couldn't call her on it without admitting he knew more about Dale's situation than a normal employer should. "Well," Thomas said, turning to me, "I should steal Zane for a few minutes. Owner business, you understand." He gestured toward the office behind the front desk, clearly wanting to get me away from Angela. I grabbed my jacket and followed him, leaving Angela standing alone in the lobby with her questions and her brother's phone. The office was barely large enough for 2 people, cramped with filing cabinets and a desk that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Thomas closed the door and immediately lowered his voice. "How long has she been asking about Dale Bean?" "Since she checked in last night. Says she's his sister, and honestly, the resemblance is there. Same eyes, same way of focusing when they want something." Thomas rubbed his forehead like he was fighting off a headache. "What exactly has she asked?" I ran through Angela's questions from the previous night and this morning, including the text message about rules not being what they seemed. Thomas's expression grew more troubled with each detail. "Listen carefully," he said when I finished. "Some of our guests aren't what they appear to be. The rules exist for very specific reasons, and they need to be followed exactly. No exceptions, no interpretation, no bending protocols because someone seems harmless. I've been following the rules. I know. But Ms. Kennedy is asking the kind of questions that suggest she knows more than she's sharing. And if she's really Dale Bean's sister..." He trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. "Just maintain normal operations. Don't volunteer information about anything unusual, and definitely don't let her convince you to break protocols." Before I could ask what he meant by guests not being what they appeared, the office door burst open. Not violently, but with enough sudden force that we both jumped. Angela stood in the doorway, breathing hard like she'd been running. "There's a woman outside who says she needs a room, but she fits the description of someone you're supposed to refuse service to." My stomach dropped. "Red dress?" "No, jeans and a t-shirt." But she specifically asked about the red dress rule when I told her you might not have rooms available. Thomas and I exchanged glances. A guest asking about the red dress rule meant either someone had talked when they shouldn't have, or we were dealing with exactly the kind of situation the rules were designed to prevent. "Where is she now?" Thomas asked. Sitting in her car in the parking lot, she said she'd wait. I pushed past both of them and headed for the lobby windows. A dark blue sedan sat near the far edge of the lot, and I could make out a woman in the driver's seat. From this distance, I couldn't see much detail, but something about her posture suggested patience rather than aggression. "I'll handle this," Thomas said, but Angela stepped in front of him. Actually, she asked for Zane specifically. Said someone told her he was the night clerk who'd understand her situation. That stopped both of us cold. Guests didn't usually request specific staff members, especially guests who might be triggering our most serious safety protocol. And the phrasing, "someone who'd understand her situation," suggested this wasn't a random encounter. "I should refuse service and ask her to leave," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't that simple. If this woman knew about the red dress rule and had specifically asked for me, then she was connected to Whispering Pines in ways that might require more than a standard refusal. Thomas checked his watch, then the lobby clock. "It's your call, but remember what I said about following protocols exactly." I walked outside, Angela and Thomas trailing behind me despite my gesture for them to stay in the lobby. The October air was crisp enough to make my breath visible, and the woman in the sedan rolled down her window as I approached. She was maybe late 30s, with short, dark hair, and the kind of alert expression that suggested law enforcement or military background. She wore jeans and a navy jacket, nothing red in sight, but something about her triggered the same internal warning system that the rule was designed to activate. "You're Zane?" she asked. "I am. Angela said you needed a room." "I do. Piper Fowler." She handed me a driver's license through the window. "I know this is irregular, but I think we have mutual concerns about what happened to Dale Bean." Behind me, I heard Thomas make a sound that might have been a curse or a prayer. Angela stepped closer, clearly trying to hear every word. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, handing back her license. "I think you are." Piper's eyes moved past me to Thomas, and something shifted in her expression. Not recognition exactly, but awareness. "I've been tracking some unusual activity in this area. Government vehicles, unexplained federal interest in local businesses. The kind of attention that might make someone stage their own disappearance to avoid uncomfortable questions." The way she said it made Dale's vanishing sound less like a mystery and more like a survival strategy. But before I could process that implication fully, movement caught my eye. The lobby clock, visible through the front windows, was displaying 3:33 on all three faces. Rule 2. 20 minutes outside, starting now. "I need to step away for a few minutes," I said, already backing toward the building. "Thomas can help you with room availability." I should have been walking away from the motel, following the protocol that had kept me safe for 6 months. Instead, I found myself moving just far enough to satisfy the rule, while maintaining sightlines to the lobby through the windows. What I saw made me question everything I thought I understood about Whispering Pines. Piper Fowler didn't approach Thomas like a stranger asking about accommodations. She walked up to him with the confident stride of someone who'd been expecting this meeting, and Thomas didn't react like a motel owner being approached by a potential guest. He reacted like someone who recognized exactly who she was and wasn't entirely happy to see her. The lobby clock straightened itself out exactly 20 minutes later, all three faces returning to their proper times like nothing had happened. I'd spent the entire break pacing the parking lot's perimeter, watching Thomas and Piper through the windows. Their conversation had looked intense, lots of hand gestures and serious expressions, but I couldn't make out any actual words. When I walked back inside, they both went silent so fast it was almost comical. Thomas was standing behind the front desk like he belonged there, while Piper had taken a seat in one of the lobby chairs with the casual posture of someone who hadn't just been deep in hushed discussion. "Everything okay out here?" I asked, though obviously it wasn't. "Fine," Thomas said, a little too quickly. "Ms. Fowler was just asking about room availability." Piper stood up, pulling out a wallet that looked suspiciously thick. "I'd like room 5 if it's available. Here's payment in advance." She placed 5 crisp $100 bills on the counter, way more than necessary for a few nights' stay. I processed her check-in on autopilot, but something about her payment method bothered me. Cash was normal enough, but brand new hundreds suggested either drug money or government expense accounts. And the way she watched me work, taking note of every keystroke and screen change, felt more like intelligence gathering than casual observation. "I have a few questions about the property," she said while I prepared her key card. "Are the basement areas accessible to guests? I saw a door marked for authorized personnel." "That's just storage and maintenance," I said, which was probably true but felt like a lie. "And what's the policy during full moon periods? Any special protocols or restrictions I should know about?" Thomas made a small noise that might have been surprise or warning. Full moon protocols weren't something normal guests asked about, and I didn't even know if we had any. Dale's incident reports had mentioned lunar patterns, but I'd assumed that was just him being paranoid about night shift weirdness. "No special policies," I said, handing over her key. "Just standard checkout times and quiet hours." Piper pocketed the key but didn't move toward the stairs. "Thank you. Oh, and if you hear any unusual sounds from the lower levels, it's probably just me working late. I'm a very light sleeper, so I tend to pace when I can't rest." She headed upstairs before I could ask what kind of work involved pacing in basements. Thomas waited until her door closed before turning to me with an expression I couldn't read. "I need to take care of some business off-site," he said. "Can you handle things here for a few hours?" "Sure, but if anyone else shows up asking about Dale Bean or unusual guests, just stick to standard responses. No details, no speculation." He grabbed his jacket from behind the counter. "And Zane, whatever you think you're starting to understand about this place, be careful who you share it with." He left before I could ask what the hell that was supposed to mean. Angela appeared at the top of the stairs as Thomas's car pulled out of the parking lot. She'd been upstairs for over an hour, and something about her posture suggested she'd found what she was looking for. "I need to show you something," she said, coming down with a small notebook in her hand. I checked Dale's old room. Thomas left it exactly as it was. His stuff is still there, including this. She placed the notebook on the counter between us. The cover was worn black leather, the kind of journal someone carried everywhere. Dale's name was written on the first page in careful block letters. "Private property laws aside," Angela said, "I think he'd want us to read this." I opened to a random page midway through and immediately recognized Dale's handwriting from the incident reports I'd inherited. But these entries were different, more detailed, more personal, and way more disturbing. March 15th, room 3. Guest left muddy prints again, but not mud. Soil composition includes elements that don't exist naturally in this region. Asked Thomas about geological surveys. He changed subject immediately. March 22nd. Government sedan parked on Access Road during night shift. Same license plate as last month. Pretended not to notice, but they're definitely monitoring something here. March 30th. Thomas received call at 2 a.m., spoke in Spanish too fast for me to follow. Afterwards, warned me about unusual activity during next few days. Room 8 guest checked out early the following morning, leaving behind items that definitely weren't human-made. Angela flipped to pages near the end. It gets worse. April 8th. The rules aren't protecting us from the guests. They're protecting the guests from something else. Thomas's behavior changes completely when he gets those monthly calls. Whatever's happening here, we're not the ones in danger. April 12th. Saw a woman in red dress watching Motel from tree line. She didn't approach building, but her body language suggested warning, not threat. Think she's trying to communicate something about the real danger. April 15th. Final decision made. Going to break Rule 4 intentionally next time I see her. If she's trying to warn us about something, we need to know what. The journal ended there. No more entries after April 15th. 3 months ago, right before Dale's disappearance. He figured it out, Angela said quietly. Whatever's really happening here, Dale understood it before he vanished. I closed the journal, mind racing through implications I didn't want to face. If Dale was right about the rules being protective rather than restrictive, then everything I thought I knew about Whispering Pines was backwards. The brown-cloaked figure, the mud prints, the tunnel sounds. Maybe they weren't threats to be avoided, but people who needed sanctuary. A soft, scraping sound echoed from somewhere below us, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. The tunnels, definitely the tunnels, even though we weren't in any kind of emergency situation that would explain movement down there. Angela and I looked at each other, then toward the authorized personnel door near the front desk. The sound came again, closer this time, and with it came the faint scent of wet earth and decomposing leaves that I recognized from room 3. We should probably ignore that, I said, but I was already moving toward the door. Probably, Angela agreed, following me. The door was unlocked, which seemed like poor security for a restricted area. Beyond it lay a narrow staircase leading down into darkness that smelled like the forest after heavy rain. Emergency lighting cast weak yellow pools every few feet, just enough to navigate without falling. We followed the scraping sounds through a maze of concrete corridors that were definitely larger and more extensive than any motel needed for basic utilities. The walls were lined with what looked like ventilation systems, but the air circulation was too sophisticated for a simple basement. This was infrastructure designed to support long-term occupancy. The sounds led us to a section where the concrete walls gave way to older stonework, and the corridor curved sharply to the left. Angela grabbed my arm as we rounded the corner, pointing to what I had initially taken for a shadow against the far wall. It was a door, painted the same dark gray as the stone around it, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, and it was slightly open, warm light spilling through the crack. I pushed it wider, revealing a small but comfortable living space. A bed with rumpled sheets, a desk covered in notebooks and papers, several changes of clothes hanging from a makeshift closet rod. Someone had been living down here for months. Jesus, Angela whispered. Dale? A figure emerged from what must have been a bathroom area, and my heart stopped. Same height, same basic build, same mess of dark hair that never stayed where it was supposed to. But his skin had a pale, almost translucent quality that made the veins beneath more visible, and when he looked directly at us, his eyes reflected the overhead light like an animal's. Hey, Angie, Dale Bean said, his voice carrying the same warmth I remembered, but with an odd resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. I was wondering when you'd find me. Angela made a sound that was part sob, part relief, part confusion. You're alive. You're actually alive. Yeah, Dale said, and his smile was both familiar and completely foreign, though I'm not exactly the same as when I left. We need to talk about what's really happening here and why the rules exist in the first place. He gestured for us to sit on the edge of his bed, then pulled up a chair from the desk. The truth is, Whispering Pines isn't what anyone thinks it is, and neither am I anymore. Dale sat forward, and in the underground lighting, the changes in his appearance became even more pronounced. The pale quality of his skin wasn't sickness. It was adaptation, like something that had learned to live in low light and underground spaces. The government has a facility about 20 miles north of here, he said, his voice carrying that strange resonance I was still getting used to. They've been capturing what they call anomalous entities for the past 5 years, testing, experimenting, trying to understand how to weaponize supernatural abilities. Angela's face went through several expressions at once. Supernatural. You're talking about actual... The brown-cloaked guy you've seen, Zane. He's a forest guardian. His territory got strip-mined 3 years ago, and he's been slowly dying ever since. The mud you keep cleaning up isn't mud. It's the last remnants of soil from his homeland. He carries it with him because without that connection, he'll fade completely. That explained the smell, the cold, the way Room 3 always felt like someplace ancient and sad. And the woman in the red dress? Dr. Harley Bishop. She's a shapeshifter who worked at the facility until she couldn't stomach what they were doing anymore. She escaped 6 months ago with evidence of the experiments, but she can't approach the motel directly because her presence triggers security protocols. The red dress rule wasn't meant to keep her out. It was meant to keep her safe from anyone who might be watching. My head was spinning. 6 months of following rules I thought were protecting me from supernatural threats, when actually I'd been part of an underground railroad for refugees fleeing government torture. So, when Thomas said some guests aren't what they appear to be, he meant they're not human, but they're not dangerous either. They're just people trying to survive. Dale's eyes caught the light again as he looked at Angela. I figured it out gradually, started asking too many questions. When I saw agents taking someone from the facility, someone who looked like a teenager but had these incredible abilities, I knew I had to do something. So, you staged your disappearance, Angela said. Thomas helped. We made it look like I'd quit suddenly, left everything behind to throw off anyone tracking my movements. I've been living down here ever since, helping coordinate safe passages to other sanctuaries. There's a whole network across Canada and the northern US. The scraping sounds I'd been hearing during my shifts, Dale moving through the tunnels, probably helping other refugees navigate between safe zones. The emergency protocols weren't about supernatural attacks, but about hiding people when authorities got too close. How many others know? I asked. Thomas has been running this operation for 3 years. A few other motel owners across the region. Some sympathetic officials who help with documentation and transport. It's small, careful, and until recently it was working. Angela leaned forward. What changed? Dale's expression darkened. Someone's been feeding information to the wrong people. The government raids have gotten more targeted, more successful. Too many refugees are disappearing between safe houses, and there's evidence that someone inside the network is compromising locations. Before I could ask who might be selling out supernatural refugees, footsteps echoed through the tunnel system. Fast, urgent footsteps heading our direction. Thomas appeared in the doorway, breathing hard and sweating despite the underground chill. We have a problem. Federal agents, 3 vehicles heading straight for the motel. They're early. This was supposed to be next week. Dale was already moving, gathering papers from his desk. How many entities are still in residence? The Guardian in room 3, obviously. 2 others in the lower tunnel networks who were supposed to transfer out tonight. Piper Fowler's upstairs, but she's not what we thought, I said, remembering her conversation with Thomas. She's federal, but not with the experimental program. Thomas looked surprised, then relieved. Congressional investigation. She's been tracking the facility operations for months, but that doesn't help us right now if her cover gets blown. Angela stood up. What about Dale? They're looking for him. No, Dale said quietly. They think Dale Bean is dead. The man who lived upstairs and worked night shifts doesn't exist anymore. But they can't know about the sanctuary operations. Thomas was checking his watch. 5 minutes, maybe less. The Guardian can't be moved. His connection to this location is too deep, and stress from relocation could kill him. The others need to reach the emergency exits. What emergency exits? I asked. The tunnels connect to the old mining system. There are 3 exits within a mile radius, but they take time to navigate safely. Thomas looked directly at me. Zane, I need you upstairs maintaining normal operations. Act like nothing unusual is happening. What about Angela? I'm staying with Dale, she said before Thomas could answer. "If agents search the tunnels, someone needs to know what happened to us." The sound of car doors slamming carried through the concrete walls. They were here. "Remember," Thomas said as we headed toward the stairs, "the rules aren't just protocol, they're protection for everyone." I climbed toward the lobby, leaving Dale and Angela in their underground hideout, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether Whispering Pines continued as a sanctuary or became another casualty of whatever war was being fought between the government and people who just wanted to survive. The lobby looked exactly the same as always, but now I understood what I was really protecting. As I settled behind the front desk and watched official vehicles pull into the parking lot, I realized Thomas was right about one thing. I'd been following the rules perfectly. I just hadn't understood whose safety depended on it. I made it to the lobby just as 3 black SUVs finished arranging themselves in our parking lot like pieces on a chessboard. Through the windows, I counted at least 8 people in tactical gear, plus a guy in a suit who was clearly running the show. He had that military bearing Thomas had warned me about, the kind of authority that didn't ask questions twice. The front door opened without a knock, which should have been my first clue that these weren't normal federal agents. The man in the suit stepped through first, scanning the lobby with the systematic attention of someone cataloging potential threats. "Good morning," he said, though it was barely past dawn. "Commander Kevin Mendez, Department of Homeland Security. We need to conduct a routine inspection of the premises." I stayed behind the front desk, trying to look like someone whose biggest concern was whether I'd get overtime pay for dealing with this. "Do you have a warrant?" "We have authorization under the Anomalous Phenomena Protection Act." He placed a folder on the counter without opening it. "Are you the current night manager?" "Just the clerk. Thomas Vargas owns the place." I gestured toward the office door. "He should be back any minute." Mendez nodded to his team, and they spread out with practiced efficiency. 2 headed for the stairs, 2 others toward the back exit, and 1 positioned herself near the authorized personnel door. The woman by the tunnel entrance looked like she knew exactly what she was guarding against. "We'll need access to all guest rooms and common areas," Mendez said. "Standard security protocol." Thomas appeared from the office, moving just slowly enough to suggest he'd been there the whole time instead of racing up from underground tunnels. "Gentlemen, how can I help you this morning?" "Mr. Vargas, we're conducting searches related to suspected smuggling activity in the region. We'll need your cooperation with room access." "Of course," Thomas said, reaching for the master key. "Though I should mention we have guests who might not appreciate being woken up this early." Mendez's expression suggested guest comfort wasn't a priority. "We'll be discreet." I watched them head upstairs, Thomas leading the way with the careful politeness of someone who had practice dealing with authority figures. The agent near the tunnel door stayed put, and I realized she wasn't just positioned randomly. She was specifically watching for movement from the basement areas. My radio crackled, and Thomas's voice came through clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Zane, could you bring the facility's inspection logs to room 5? Ms. Fowler requested them." Piper's room. Thomas was giving her advance warning, which meant she was about to play whatever card she'd been holding. I grabbed a random clipboard and headed upstairs, passing agents in the hallway who were using handheld devices that definitely weren't standard security equipment. The readings they were getting made them exchange glances that weren't reassuring. Piper opened her door before I could knock, dressed and alert like she'd been expecting this visit. "Thank you," she said loudly enough for the agents to hear, then pulled me inside and closed the door. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said quietly, showing me credentials that looked more official than Mendez's. "Congressional Oversight Investigation into Unauthorized Experimentation Programs. I need you to listen carefully." Before I could respond, she opened her laptop and hit a key. Immediately, every electronic device in the building started behaving strangely. The lobby music cut out, the hallway lights flickered, and I could hear agents downstairs talking about communication interference. "Signal jammer," Piper explained. This facility has been conducting illegal experiments on sentient beings. I've been gathering evidence for 6 months, but I need more time to complete the transmission to my oversight committee. Through the door, we could hear Mendez's voice getting sharper as his team reported their findings. Room 3 was apparently anomalous but unoccupied. The basement showed irregular heat signatures and something about biological traces inconsistent with human habitation. Piper moved to her window, looking down at the parking lot where more vehicles were arriving. They found something. I need to redirect their search parameters before they dig deeper. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, projecting the kind of federal authority that made even Mendez pause. Commander, Agent Fowler, FBI. I'm investigating potential human trafficking operations in this region. Are your findings consistent with organized transportation of undocumented persons? The question was brilliant. It gave Mendez a conventional explanation for any unusual evidence while positioning Piper as having jurisdiction over whatever they found. For a few minutes, the two of them engaged in bureaucratic territory, marking that bought Thomas time to navigate the room searches. But then one of the agents called up from the lobby. Commander, we found the concealed entrance. My stomach dropped. They'd found the authorized personnel door, which meant Dale and Angela were about to have company whether they were ready or not. Mendez looked at Piper with new suspicion. Agent Fowler, I'm going to need to see your authorization for operating in our sector. Instead of answering, Piper's radio came to life with a burst of static, followed by a voice I didn't recognize. All units, be advised. Local facilities may be experiencing unusual electromagnetic phenomena. Recommend standard contamination protocols. That wasn't any normal radio transmission. The voice carried the same otherworldly resonance I'd heard in Dale's speech, and Piper's expression suggested she was hearing something different than the rest of us. The shapeshifter, she said quietly. She's close enough to establish contact. Mendez was already moving toward the stairs. Secure that basement entrance. Full sweep of sublevels. Thomas met us in the lobby, his composed expression starting to crack. Commander, I'm afraid insurance regulations require advance notice before accessing utility areas. Liability concerns, you understand. We'll assume liability, Mendez said, pushing past him toward the tunnel door. That's when Thomas did something I'd never seen before. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text message, then looked directly at me. Zane, I need you to activate the emergency protocols we discussed. We'd never discussed any emergency protocols, but I understood. This was the moment Thomas had been preparing for, when keeping secrets became impossible and protecting people became the only priority. I moved behind the front desk and found a red button hidden under the edge of the counter. Thomas nodded once, and I pressed it. Every door in the building locked simultaneously with a soft electronic click that echoed through the lobby like a starting gun. Emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in amber. And somewhere in the walls I could hear machinery humming to life that I'd never noticed before. Lockdown protocol, Thomas announced calmly. Fire suppression system detected irregular air quality. Building sealed for safety until all clear signal. Mendez drew his weapon. Override the lockdown, now. 45-minute cycle, Thomas said. Can't be interrupted once initiated. Federal safety regulations. Through the windows, I could see agents outside trying door handles and finding them sealed. More importantly, I could see a figure in a red dress finally emerging from the tree line, no longer hiding from security protocols that had just been rendered irrelevant. Piper stepped forward, her FBI credentials now openly displayed. Commander Mendez, you're about to be arrested for violation of congressional oversight authority and crimes against sentient beings. The evidence has been transmitted and arrest warrants are being processed. Mendez looked around the lobby, at Thomas standing calmly by the locked tunnel door, at me behind the counter with my hand still on the emergency button, at Piper, whose federal authority suddenly carried more weight than his own. "What exactly do you people think you're protecting?" he asked. Through the radio static that was still crackling from Piper's equipment, Dale's voice came through clearly enough for everyone to hear. "The same thing you've been trying to destroy. People who just want to survive. The lockdown had bought us time, but it had also trapped us all inside together. Whatever happened next, there would be no more hiding what Whispering Pines really was." The amber emergency lighting made everything in the lobby feel like we were underwater, which seemed appropriate since we were all drowning in revelations that had been building for months. Piper stepped forward with her credentials raised high enough for everyone to see. "Commander Mendez, under authority of Congressional Resolution 847, I'm declaring this facility a federal crime scene pending investigation into violations of the Constitutional Protection Act." "The what now?" I managed to say, because apparently my brain had decided this was the moment to focus on bureaucratic details. "Sentient beings have constitutional rights," Piper explained, never taking her eyes off Mendez. "Your facility has been conducting experiments that qualify as torture under international law." Mendez kept his weapon drawn, but his authority was slipping fast. "Agent Fowler, you're interfering with a national security operation." "No," came Dale's voice through the radio static, clearer now. "She's stopping a war crime." The tunnel door behind Thomas opened with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than the lockdown activation. Dale emerged first, looking exactly like he had underground, but moving with new confidence. Angela followed, clutching a laptop and looking determined in that way that meant she'd made a decision that would change everything. But then something else stepped through the doorway that made everyone in the lobby go completely still. The brown-cloaked figure I'd seen 3 nights a week for 6 months slowly pulled back his hood. His face was ancient but not human, features that suggested indigenous heritage but older, deeper, like something carved from living wood. His hair moved like wind through leaves even in the still air, and his eyes held the depth of old-growth forests. "I am Kittigan," he said, his voice carrying the sound of branches in winter storms. "Guardian of the northern waters and keeper of the deep places. I offer testimony against those who destroyed my people's sacred lands in the name of progress." Mendez's weapon lowered slightly. "You don't point guns at forces of nature, even if you're trained to." Thomas moved to stand beside Kittigan. "Commander, you're looking at a being whose territory was strip-mined by a government-contracted mining operation. His people lived in harmony with the ecosystem for over 3 centuries before industrial development displaced them." "His people?" Mendez asked. "Forest guardians, water protectors, beings who maintained the balance between human development and natural preservation," Piper said, consulting her phone. "According to my investigation, your facility has captured and experimented on 17 similar entities over the past 5 years." Angela looked up from her laptop. "I've been mapping the digital infrastructure for months. Every safe house, every communication network, every documented disappearance. The pattern shows systematic targeting of protective spirits tied to specific territories." She turned the screen toward us, showing a map dotted with red markers across northern Canada and the United States. "But I can build something better. Encrypted communication networks, digital sanctuary coordination, location masking protocols. No more physical safe houses that can be compromised." Dale nodded. Angela's right. The old system was too vulnerable. Too many people knew too much, and eventually someone was going to sell out the wrong location. "Speaking of which," Piper said, checking her phone again, "arrest warrants just came through. Commander Mendez, you and your team are being charged with conspiracy to commit torture, violation of congressional oversight, and crimes against sentient beings." Through the windows, I could see more vehicles arriving, but these had FBI markings instead of unmarked federal plates. Piper's backup had arrived right on schedule. Mendez holstered his weapon, his face showing the expression of someone whose worldview had just collapsed. "These aren't people. They're security threats." "They're refugees," Thomas said firmly. "Beings whose homes have been destroyed by industrial development, who need temporary sanctuary while finding new territories or adapting to environmental changes." Kittigan stepped forward, and the temperature in the lobby dropped 10 degrees. "Your people strip forests, drain wetlands, build roads through sacred places. When guardians try to protect what remains, you capture us for study. When we flee, you hunt us." "But that's changing," Piper said, addressing the room rather than Mendez specifically. "Congressional oversight has been investigating this program for 8 months. The evidence transmission is complete, and new protocols are being established for interspecies cooperation." Angela closed her laptop. "The digital network goes live tonight. Secure communications, resource coordination, emergency alerts. No more people disappearing between safe houses." I looked around the lobby, at Dale, who'd chosen transformation over hiding, at Angela, who'd turned her desperate search into a solution for everyone, at Thomas, who was finally able to stop keeping secrets, at Kittigan, who was trusting humans after years of persecution. "So, what happens to the motel?" I asked. Thomas smiled for the first time since I'd known him. "New management structure, legitimate refugee services instead of hidden sanctuary operations. Dale's volunteered to serve as official liaison between human and supernatural communities." "And you?" he asked me. I thought about 6 months of following rules I didn't understand, protecting people I'd never seen clearly, maintaining protocols that seemed designed to keep me isolated and afraid. Then, I thought about what those rules had actually accomplished: providing sanctuary for displaced beings, maintaining safe passage through dangerous territory, preserving connections between communities that needed each other. "I'll take the job," I said, "head of sanctuary operations, but we're rewriting the rules to make sense." Dale laughed, the sound carrying both his familiar humanity and something deeper. "The rules already make sense, Zane. You just understand them now." The FBI agents were processing Mendez and his team while Piper coordinated with officials who apparently had been waiting months for authorization to shut down the experimental program. Kittigan was speaking with representatives about establishing legitimate territorial protections for displaced guardians. 3 hours after the lockdown ended, I was behind the front desk again, but everything had changed. The emergency lighting had been replaced with normal illumination. The tunnel door stood open with people moving freely between levels, and Thomas was coordinating with officials who actually knew what Whispering Pines was supposed to be. That's when she finally approached the front desk. The woman in the red dress looked exactly like Dale had described: late 30s, professional bearing, but with something in her movements that suggested controlled shape-shifting abilities. She placed identification on the counter: Dr. Harley Bishop, with credentials from 3 different universities. "I'd like to check into room 4, she said, "and I believe you have some questions about biological adaptation protocols." I processed her registration, entering her real name into the system for the first time in the motel's history. The computer accepted it without problems, as if it had been waiting for this moment. "Welcome to Whispering Pines," I said, handing her the key. "Thomas mentioned you might have information about helping entities adapt to environmental displacement." 3 years of research data, she confirmed, plus evidence of systematic habitat destruction and recommendations for sustainable coexistence protocols. Angela looked up from setting up her new communication equipment in the lobby. "Dr. Bishop, I could use consultation on the biological monitoring systems for the digital network." "I'd be happy to help," Harley said. "It's good to finally be able to work openly again." Dale emerged from the tunnel area carrying files that were apparently no longer classified secrets. "The transport network is being restructured too. Instead of hiding refugees, we're providing documented transition services." I opened the guest registry, looking at the entries for the first time without worrying about what I wasn't supposed to see. Room 3, Kittigan, Forest Guardian. Room 4, Dr. Harley Bishop, Biological Research Consultant. Room 5, Agent Piper Fowler, Congressional Liaison. Room 7, Angela Kennedy, Digital Infrastructure Coordinator. For 6 months, I'd thought the rules were protecting me from supernatural threats. It turned out they'd been protecting supernatural refugees from institutional threats. Now we were all on the same side, working toward the same goal. Thomas returned from his coordination meeting looking relieved for the first time since I'd known him. New federal protocols go into effect next week: legitimate funding, oversight committees, and legal protections for displaced entities. And in the meantime? I asked. In the meantime, he said, we do what we've always done. We keep people safe, we maintain sanctuary, and we follow the rules that actually matter. I looked around the lobby at the strangest collection of individuals who'd ever shared the same space. Human and non-human, federal agents and refugees, scientists and guardians, all working together toward something that had seemed impossible that morning. The rules haven't changed, I realized. We just finally understand what they're for. Outside, the last of the federal vehicles were leaving, taking with them the secrecy that had defined this place for 3 years. Tomorrow, Whispering Pines would operate as the first officially recognized supernatural refugee facility in North America. Tonight, we still had guests to protect, networks to coordinate, and sanctuary to maintain. The rules remained the same: never ask real names unless freely given, provide safe passage during vulnerable hours, maintain secure spaces for those who needed them, refuse service to anyone who posed a threat to refugees, and ignore suspicious activity unless lives were at stake. I'd been following them perfectly all along. I just hadn't understood whose lives depended on it.